Mr Speaker, I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Call Charles Chauvel.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, as we've heard, one of the key purposes of this bill is to replace the four governing bodies of Creative New Zealand, including the Arts Council, with a single body, which itself will be called the Arts Council, and as we've heard, will have 13 members. That single board will have responsibility for determining the strategic direction, priorities and a policy framework for the entire organisation and for funding allocation decisions. Well, sir, I think it's important on behalf of the Labour Party to record a couple of key points that we think need to be made in this debate and which are important as far as understanding the position we take on this legislation is concerned. Arts are the heart and soul of our country. If we look at the way in which the sector flourished, particularly in those years when Helen Clark held the arts portfolio, an important way of symbolising the importance of the creative sector to the government, then we see the truth of this. The arts reflect the unique identity of this country. They're how we reflect ourselves. And it's obvious from any number of recent events that we could describe that our cultural diversity is one of the drivers of our social and cultural capital. These are intangibles, they're difficult to measure, sir, but nothing is more important than our cultural patrimony as expressed through the arts, culture and heritage sector. Now, the reason that the New Zealand Labour Party has real concerns about this legislation relate to the abolition of important sectoral representation inside Creative New Zealand and the attempts to mainstream that representation on one single board. And really the approach we're taking is if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The extraordinary flowering from the Māori Renaissance and later the Pacifica Renaissance culturally in this country has in part been able to be attributed to the fact that Te Waka Toi and the Pacific Committee of the Arts Council have been creatures of those renaissances. They have reflected that cultural flowering, they have sponsored it, they've understood it, and they've ensured that by working in partnership with the sectors which they sponsor and for which they're responsible for ensuring continued partnership, we see wonderful things happening. And our fear is that through the structures that we put in place by this legislation, Pacific Island, Māori and other ethnic groups, also other groups in society will just be overwhelmed by the structure of the proposed so-called streamlined council. And this just isn't a fear that we hold. We've had many stakeholders from the sector approach us and express this concern. Some of those concerns came through in the submissions to the Select Committee, but many artists, many Māori, Pacific and other artists have expressed these concerns individually. Now, they're not always willing to come to the government and express those concerns. And I think it's important for the Minister and the Chamber to hear this. I know he himself doesn't engage in this sort of conduct, but there are people out there who are frightened of expressing these perspectives because they don't want to suffer in terms of funding decisions or other sort of vindictive or petty revenge from his colleagues. And I think the fact that that is a live concern that has been expressed by folk in the artistic sector is a real indictment on this government, and in particular on the Minister who's just resumed his seat. The reality of the sector under Christopher Finlayson is very different to the rosy picture that he's just tried to paint in his speech. So getting rid of the Te Waka Toi Committee and replacing it with 4 persons who will be charged with representing Māori and Māori perspectives on a council of 13 members really invites one to do the maths. There is a real danger that moving from the current structure to moving to 4 out of 13 will simply lead to that particular perspective being swamped. And there's simply no way around the mathematical reality here. We have to ask and look very long and hard at the question of whether we are ready as a society to do this culturally with our arts sector. And our judgment, and the judgment of many participants in the sector, is it's simply premature. And in fact, many Māori artists and other Māori with a stake in the sector have told us that this is the case. The Minister said in his speech, well, the 4 members required to reflect a Māori perspective will be statutorily designated as a committee themselves. They'll be able to call themselves Te Waka Toi if they want. Well, surely that begs the question, why do away with Te Waka Toi in the first place if his expectation is simply that these 4 members will immediately redesignate themselves as such as soon as the legislation passes? So you're also disbanding the South Pacific Arts Committee and replacing it with only 2 members to represent Pacific Island peoples and their culture has a real potential for loss of distinctive recognition of the differences between Pacific Island communities in New Zealand and as to the unique cultural contribution that they make, particularly in Auckland, the largest Pacific city on the planet, but also across New Zealand, wherever there are Pacific communities contributing to the sector in the way that currently happens. Now, the Minister foreshadowed a supplementary order paper in this area. Obviously, it's a pity that we don't have that supplementary order paper yet. A shame that this is becoming the practice of that Minister and this government. We can only go on what he tells us will be in the supplementary order paper. Well, it doesn't sound as if it will do much to address our concerns, but of course we'll look at it in the committee stages. If the Minister's proposal succeeds and these committees are done away with, then clearly it will be incumbent on this House to monitor the impact of the loss of the 2 committees and to review future funding decisions of the Council to ensure that they do actually reflect the diversity that is now New Zealand society. And we're not convinced that the assessment process by a subordinate panel, which is the proposal as I understand it, will give due recognition of the cultural contribution that could be made by an applicant for funding. The other concern that arises, sir, out of the submissions process and analysis of the bill is that community arts development funding is in real danger. Because it has to compete against the demands in a recession of funding for professional arts. There's a classic example in Wellington. If you look at the theatre sector, you've got essentially a commercial operation at Circa, an experimental entry-level experience at Bats, and something in the middle trying to do something creative and unique and responsive to the changing contemporary audience demands at Downstage. Now, how are those various competing interests going to be dealt with? It just isn't clear under this bill. And the concern, sir, is that really the legislation reflects the perspective and the personality of the Minister. It is a bit elitist. It does appear to be for the benefit of a smaller range of artists, and it doesn't appear to be aimed at the broader spectrum that makes up our creative arts community. It's a real concern, I think, sir, that the bill makes no mention whatever of the importance of project-based funding in infrastructure and capital. We're also concerned, sir, that the Arts Council is no longer to be required to prepare and publish, after public consultation, a strategic plan every 3 years. Now, the Minister dismissed all this as red tape. We fear that it's simply, again, representative of his desire for a top-down approach from the Minister's office to the sector, dictating what will be funded according to his preferences. That isn't going to work in our creative sector, sir. This, sir, is a concern, that the approach in the legislation is a concern to us. We compare it to what we saw a couple of nights ago with the Heritage New Zealand Aotearoa bill, where again you have, in a governance sense, an attempt to do away with the representatives of ordinary members and replace them with a governance board. So, sir, we'll be looking very carefully at these changes. We have supplementary order papers we'll be moving at the committee stage, but we maintain our opposition to the bill for the reasons that I've advanced.
Kanwal Bakshi.